I'm 81 years old, and last year I did something that no one in my family knows I did. I changed my will. Not because I'd had a change of heart about who deserved what. Not because someone had hurt me. Not because my attorney suggested it. I did it to see what would happen, to see who would call, how, and why. What I discovered in the weeks that followed changed something in me permanently. Not with bitterness, not with anger, with a clarity I hadn't had in years. I'm going to tell you everything, because if you have adult children, if you have assets, if you've spent your life loving people who maybe love you back, you need to hear what I saw. Let me tell you how the idea came to me. It started on a Sunday in November. My oldest son, Robert, had come for dinner with his wife. A pleasant enough evening on the surface. Good wine, a pie I'd made myself, news about the grandchildren. And then, at the end of the meal, while I was pouring coffee, Robert said something that seemed offhand. He mentioned, in passing, that he and his wife had been looking at houses in Connecticut, that prices had gotten out of control, that it had become really difficult for their generation. He didn't ask for anything directly, but I heard the question underneath. It wasn't the first time. Over the past 2 years, I had noticed a different way of talking to me, more attentive on the surface, more present at holidays, but with something underneath that I couldn't quite name, as if the conversations had acquired a subtext that nobody acknowledged out loud. That night, after they left, I sat in my chair and thought for a long time, and I asked myself a question I had never dared to put into words clearly. Do they love me, or do they love what I represent to them? The next morning, I called my attorney. Here's what I did. I changed my will in a significant way. Not to disinherit anyone, not to punish, but to redistribute in a way that would create a surprise. I substantially reduced Robert's share. I increased the share going to my younger daughter, Catherine, with whom I had a more distant but more honest relationship. And I added several charities that have mattered to me for years, a local food bank, a literacy program for adults, and a small animal shelter in the town where I grew up. Then I did something deliberate. I let it slip, not directly, not by announcing numbers. But at a family dinner a few weeks later, I mentioned casually that I'd been meeting with my attorney, that I'd been rethinking some things, that I felt my arrangements needed to reflect who I actually was now, not who I was 15 years ago when I'd last updated everything. And then I watched. The first sign came from Robert. 3 days after that dinner, he called on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual. Robert calls on Sundays. That's been his pattern for years. Tuesday morning was new. The conversation started normally. Weather, the kids, how I was feeling. And then, with a precision that was dressed up as casualness, he said, "You know, Mom, we've never really talked about all of this. About what you want. About how you see things going forward." I said that was true. He continued, carefully, gently, with words that sounded spontaneous and weren't. He talked about stability, about the complexity of estates, about how some families plan ahead to avoid complications, about how it can actually be an act of love to think through these things while everyone is still healthy and clear-headed. He never asked me directly what I had changed, but every sentence moved toward that question without ever arriving at it. I listened. I answered vaguely. I hung up, and I sat for a long time with the phone in my hand, because what I had just heard wasn't a conversation, it was an assessment. The following week it was my daughter-in-law. She invited me to lunch, just the two of us, which hadn't happened in several years. It was pleasant, really. She was charming, attentive, interested in what I was saying. Maybe too interested. There is a way of being listened to that feels like love, and there is a way of being listened to that feels like an investigation. This was the second kind. At one point, somewhere between the entree and dessert, she said something that stopped me cold. She said, gently, with a warm smile, that Robert and she thought about me often, that they worried, that the house was a lot for one person to manage alone, that they'd been reading about some wonderful senior communities, very modern, with activities and staff and people your own age, that some of their friends had helped their parents make that transition, and everyone had been so much happier for it. And then she added, and this is the sentence I will never forget, that of course that kind of move required some financial planning, that it was the kind of decision that needed to be thought through in advance, while you still had the capacity to think it through clearly. While you still had the capacity. I looked at my daughter-in-law across that table, and I saw, for the first time with complete clarity, what I had been refusing to see for months. She wasn't worried about me. She was worried about what would be left after me. I want to be fair here, because this story isn't simple, and I refuse to make it simple. Robert is not a bad son. He is not a villain. He is not someone who doesn't love me. I believe he loves me, but I also believe that he had begun, perhaps without fully realizing it, perhaps without ever saying it clearly even to himself, to make quiet calculations about what the house is worth, about what the accounts represent, about the timeline, about how to position himself so that the transition, when it comes, is smooth. These are not monstrous calculations. They are human calculations, the kind that ordinary people make when they have their own pressures, their own fears, their own children to think about. But they are calculations, and once you have seen them, you cannot pretend you haven't. Catherine reacted differently. My younger daughter, the one I'm less close to on paper, the one who calls less regularly, the one who sometimes forgets birthdays. When I mentioned the changes at that family dinner, Catherine looked up from her plate and said, "It's your money, Mom. Do whatever makes sense to you." That was it. No follow-up call, no lunch invitation, no gentle conversation about senior communities or financial planning or what I wanted for my future. Just, "It's your money." 4 words that told me more about my daughter than 20 years of Sunday phone calls had. Because those 4 words meant, I am not counting it. They meant, your life is not a transaction I am waiting to complete. They meant, I love you without a number attached. I cried in my kitchen that night, not from sadness, from something that felt more like relief, like putting down a weight I hadn't known I was carrying. Now I want to tell you what this experience taught me. Because this isn't just my story. I have spoken to women my age, women in their 70s, 80s, 90s, who recognize exactly what I'm describing. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Enough to know that what I experienced is not unusual, that the quiet calculations happen in more families than anyone wants to admit, that the subtext in conversations about your health, your home, your future is sometimes not about you at all. It is about the inventory. And here is what I learned from my 3 weeks of watching. The people who love you for who you are don't change when the will changes. They don't call more. They don't become more attentive. They don't suddenly develop an interest in your financial planning. They stay exactly the same because they were never there for the ending. They were there for you. I also learned something about myself that I wasn't expecting. I had been complicit, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, daily way that older parents often are. I had made myself useful in financial ways because usefulness felt like love. I had offered help before it was asked because offering felt like being needed. I had made my assets visible, mentioned the house, mentioned the accounts, mentioned the plans, because visibility felt like belonging. I had, without meaning to, put a price on myself, and once you put a price on yourself, you invite people to calculate it. I am not saying my children are wrong for knowing that I have a house and savings. They are adults. They are not blind. Of course they know, but there is a difference between knowing and counting, and I had made it too easy to count. Here is the harder truth. After I changed my will, after I watched what happened, after I had my conversation with Catherine, I changed it back. Not entirely. I kept the charities, I kept some of the redistribution, but I made it more equitable than the experiment had required, because punishing Robert for being human was not the point. The point was to see clearly, and now I see clearly. I see which relationships in my life are about me, and which are about what I represent. I see where the warmth is genuine and where it is strategic. I see who calls on a random Tuesday and why. And I make decisions accordingly, not with anger, not with punishment, with clarity. There is one more thing I want to say. If you are in the middle of this, if you recognize something in what I'm describing, I want to ask you something directly. When did you last have a conversation with your children that had nothing to do with your health, your home, your plans, your assets, or your future? When did someone last call just to hear your voice? When did someone last ask what you were reading, or what you were thinking about, or what made you laugh this week? If you can answer that question easily, you are fortunate. Hold on to those people. Show up for them. They are the ones who see you. And if the question is harder to answer than it should be, that is information, not a reason for bitterness, a reason for clarity. Because knowing who loves you and who loves what you represent is not a painful thing to know. It is a freeing thing. It tells you where to put your energy, where to put your trust, where to be open, and where to be careful. It tells you, in the most practical sense, who you are actually dealing with. I'm 81 years old. I live in my own home. I manage my own finances. I make my own decisions about my own life. And I know something now that took me 8 decades to learn. Your value as a person is not the same as the value of your estate. The people who know the difference are the ones worth keeping close. The people who don't, they are not villains. They are just confused about what they're actually there for. My job, at 81, is not to be angry about that confusion. My job is not to fund it either. I changed my will because I wanted to see what was real. What I found was this: one daughter who said, "It's your money," without needing to know the number, and a family that had, without meaning to, put a price on my life before it was over. I am not a tragedy. I am not a victim. I am a woman who finally looked clearly at the room she was in. And I am telling you to look clearly at yours, because the people who love you should not need to know what you're worth. They should already know that you are.